Mark Carney has turned parliamentary debate into a moment of truth, not for talking points, but for facts. This week in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney and opposition leader Pierre Poilievre clashed in the House of Commons. What could have been routine back and forth turned into something bigger, a test of whose vision for Canada carries more weight and more truth. Why does it matter? Because Canada right now is under strain. Families are battling food and housing costs. Inflation is eating into wages, and trade fights with the U.S. threaten billions in exports. In response, Carney has unveiled a 60 billion Canadian dollar national projects package to expand ports, LNG, and critical minerals, and pledged to break down internal trade barriers by July 1st to finally move Canada toward a single domestic market. At the same time, polling shows Canadians rate him stronger than Poilievre on top issues like inflation, cost of living, and trade. But skepticism remains about whether his promises can actually be delivered. That sets up three questions we'll answer in this video. Did Carney deliver on the promises Poilievre claims he's already broken? Is Poilievre right about Canada's economy sliding to the bottom of the G7? And most importantly, which leader's plan reflects the reality Canadians are living, and which one is just noise? If Carney claims he's acting, then we need to measure those claims against facts. So let's start with Poilievre's accusations and test them one by one. Promise versus reality, claims made by Poilievre. In the House of Commons, Pierre Poilievre unleashed a barrage of accusations that Canada's economy is shrinking faster than any G7 nation, that inflation is climbing again, that families can't afford food, that the budget Carney promised in October never arrived, that deficits are doubling, and that unemployment is spiraling. Big claims, so let's test them. Start with growth. StatsCan reported the economy contracted by 0.4% in quarter 2 2025. That's a real setback, and international trackers did flag Canada as one of the weaker G7 performers for that quarter. But calling it the fastest shrinking economy is selective. Some G7 partners also dipped, and the picture changes depending on which measure you use. In other words, Canada's struggling, but the headline is a stretch, then inflation. Overall consumer prices cooled to 1.9% in August, within the Bank of Canada's target range. But dig into the grocery aisle, and the pain is real. Food inflation hit 3.4% year over year, with meat and produce leading the surge. So, Poilievre is right that Canadians feel squeezed at the checkout, but wrong to suggest inflation is out of control. On the budget, Poilievre hammered Carney for missing an October deadline. And he's not wrong. Finance Minister Champagne confirmed the government will table its first full budget on November 4th, 2025, weeks later than originally signaled. What about deficits? Independent watchdogs, including the Parliamentary Budget Officer, warn that fiscal gaps are widening as costs pile up. Still, the idea that deficits have doubled oversimplifies shifting projections. They're bigger, yes, but doubling is a political slogan, not a verified number. And jobs? Here, Poilievre is on solid ground. Unemployment hit 7.1% in August 2025, the highest since 2016 outside of pandemic spikes. That's not a talking point, that's StatsCan. So where does that leave us? Some of Poilievre's shots land on growth, food costs, jobs, and the late budget. Others, like the fastest shrinking line and doubling deficits, rely on spin. The bigger question now, if Poilievre is pointing out the cracks, is Carney actually fixing them? Let's turn to what the Prime Minister has done and promised so far. What Carney has delivered: infrastructure, tax cuts, projects. Mark Carney hasn't been shy about rolling out big promises, and he's put some on paper. The most eye-catching is his 60 billion Canadian dollars major projects package, unveiled this month. It includes LNG expansion, critical minerals development, modular nuclear reactors, and even a new port project. The goal is simple: speed up approvals, get shovels in the ground, and build export capacity that Canada has long talked about but rarely delivered. He also ticked off a bread and butter campaign pledge, a middle-class tax cut. Since July 1st, about 22 million Canadians have been paying less tax, thanks to a reduction in the lowest bracket, relief worth roughly $27 billion over 5 years. That's not rhetoric. It's already showing up in paychecks. Housing, the issue dominating dinner table conversations, has its own marquee policy: Build Canada Homes, a 13 billion Canadian dollar plan to lower construction costs and push more affordable units into supply. The government is pairing federal land and financing with private developers to get projects moving, trying to prove Ottawa can bend the cost curve. And Carney has staked political capital on something less visible, but potentially just as transformative: internal free trade. He set a target of July 1st to cut regulatory barriers between provinces, promising Canadians a single domestic market that works as smoothly as international trade deals. Economists say that could lift GDP by several points if fully delivered. Of course, every move carries caveats. Fast-tracking mega projects invites court challenges over environmental review and Indigenous consent. Housing money doesn't guarantee homes will rise quickly, and interprovincial trade reform has defeated many prime ministers before Carney. So yes, Carney has chalked up concrete wins on taxes, housing, and mega projects. But the real question is whether Canadians feel the impact, and whether they believe it's enough. That's where the polling comes in. Public opinion and polling, who trusts whom? If Parliament felt like a clash of personalities, the polling shows it's really a clash of trust. Recent Angus Reid surveys reveal that Canadians give Mark Carney the edge on nearly every major file, from managing trade and foreign relations to growing the economy and even healthcare. On the cost of living, however, the race is razor thin. Both Carney and Poilievre are trusted by about 37% of Canadians. That tells us inflation and affordability remain the defining battleground. When Canadians are asked what keeps them up at night, rising prices and grocery bills dominate. It's why Poilievre leans so heavily on the theme, calling out food inflation, housing costs, and deficits. But here's the catch. While many agree life has become more expensive, fewer buy into his claim that Canada is the worst performer in the G7 or that inflation is spiraling faster than ever. Voters are living the squeeze, but they also recognize when the message drifts into exaggeration. That tension shows in Poilievre's own numbers. While his attack lines go viral, an Angus Reid report found that more than half of Canadians who considered voting Conservative but didn't say they view him as insincere or disconnected from their priorities. By contrast, Carney's favorability sits at around plus 13 net, while Poilievre trails at about minus 19, a gap of more than 30 points in net trust. So, the contrast mirrors the House debate itself. Carney is seen as the planner with a long-term map, Poilievre as the scrapper with sharp one-liners. Both approaches resonate, but Canadians appear to reward the one that feels more grounded in reality. But polling only tells us how people feel in the moment. To judge the clash, we need to look at the policy context itself: trade, inflation, housing, and see whether Carney's claims match the evidence. Key policy contexts: trade, sovereignty, inflation pressures. Behind the sharp exchanges in Parliament are real pressures shaping Canada's economy, and they explain why this debate matters. Three stand out: trade tensions, inflation, and housing. First, trade. Carney has framed Canada's relationship with the U.S. as both an opportunity and a vulnerability. When Washington slapped tariffs on steel, aluminum, and even cars earlier this year, Carney called it a direct challenge to Canadian sovereignty and answered with retaliatory measures. At the same time, he's promised to slash barriers inside Canada itself, pushing for full internal free trade by July 1st, arguing that a stronger domestic market is the best shield against external shocks. Second, inflation. Here, the numbers complicate the story. Overall inflation has slowed, sitting at about 1.9% in August, below expectations. That undermines Poilievre's charge that inflation is accelerating. But for Canadians in grocery aisles, the picture feels different. Food prices are still climbing, up about 3.5% year over year, with meat and staples hitting households hardest. Core inflation, which strips out the most volatile items, is still above 3%, reminding everyone that affordability remains fragile. Third, housing. Nothing dominates kitchen table talk more than rent and mortgages. Carney's government has launched Build Canada Homes, backed by 13 billion Canadian dollars, to speed up construction and lower costs. But housing is a slow burn problem. Rents in major cities have jumped more than 20% in recent years, and while projects are announced, the payoff is measured in years, not months. That leaves Canadians asking whether relief will come fast enough. Together, these issues show why the House clash wasn't just political theater. Carney is betting on big structural fixes: infrastructure, trade reform, housing programs, while Poilievre leans on the frustration many feel in the short term. And that brings us to the real bottom line. Whose message stands up when tested? The one built on delivery or the one built on optics? What Canadians are choosing between? At the heart of this clash is a choice between two very different roadmaps for Canada's future. Pierre Poilievre's path is built on speed. He promises to cut through red tape, roll back regulations, and open the doors wide for resource projects, pipelines, mines, and energy development. His pitch is simple. Fewer rules mean lower costs, more jobs, and a shot of adrenaline for the economy. In theory, that kind of deregulation could deliver quick wins for investors and families desperate for relief. But the reality is more complicated. Major projects in Canada still run into Indigenous consultations, financing hurdles, and international trade rules. Barriers that can't be erased by decree. The risk is that even with promises of speed, projects stall in courtrooms or negotiations. Mark Carney's path takes the opposite angle. Instead of chasing fast wins, he argues Canada needs deep structural fixes. His government has rolled out a 60 billion Canadian dollar infrastructure agenda, a 13 billion Canadian dollar housing program, and a deadline to break down interprovincial trade barriers by July 1st. Carney frames these as long-term bets, building internal strength so Canada can weather external threats like U.S. tariffs or global market shocks. The upside is resilience, the downside is patience. Voters may not feel a new bridge or housing project in their wallets tomorrow. So which vision is more realistic right now? Poilievre's approach may feel more urgent, but its speed runs into political and legal roadblocks. Carney's plan may take longer, but it fits the scale of the challenges Canada faces, from inflation pressures to sovereignty questions with its largest trading partner. That's the real test. Which vision holds up not just in speeches, but when it collides with reality, the budgets, the timelines, and the choices Canadians face every day. Outro. In the end, that fiery clash in the House wasn't just noise. Carney came armed with budgets, infrastructure plans, and timelines. Evidence that his arguments weren't only political theater. Poilievre, for his part, tapped into real frustrations over the cost of living and affordability. But his sharp critiques often leaned on oversimplification, sidestepping the hard policy details that Canadians know can't be wished away. It circles back to where we started. In a moment where facts are under pressure, Carney chose to build arguments, not clickbait. People can shout slogans, but policy, data, and credibility decide who holds power, not who yells louder in Parliament.